In a Victorian parlor, one wrong movement could lower your value before anyone had even learned your name. A bent spine, a restless hand, an elbow too free, and the room might remember you badly for months. That is what makes this world so strange. Etiquette is not simply politeness here. It is a silent system of judgment, where posture, breath, stillness, and even the way you take a seat can speak for your character before you ever open your mouth. And if we want to understand Victorian women properly, we have to begin there, in that unnervingly quiet pressure. Nothing dramatic has happened. No one has shouted. No door has slammed. And yet the danger is already present. You are sitting too visibly inside a culture that reads the body the way other ages read letters. A woman may not be ruined by one gesture alone, but she can certainly be measured by it, discussed through it, and quietly diminished by the impression it leaves behind. That is why the room feels so exhausting. Every inch of the body seems to have been given a meaning it never asked for. Hands suggest discipline or nervousness. Shoulders suggest breeding or slackness. Silence suggests modesty, unless it lasts too long and becomes awkwardness. Even comfort itself begins to look suspicious in this world. A woman was not only expected to behave well, she was expected to perform virtue with every inch of her body. We do not need to hold all those rules at once yet. For now, it is enough to feel the strange pressure of the room and the soft burden of being watched so closely. So let us settle into that parlor slowly now and allow the larger system behind it to come into view. So let us enter this world gently. It is a world of lace cuffs, cooling tea, polished furniture, and women sitting a little straighter than comfort allows. At first, it seems graceful enough. A parlor, a quiet visit, a civilized afternoon. But the longer you remain there, the more you feel the pressure beneath the softness. The room is calm, yet never fully relaxed. We do not need to hurry through that feeling. This story is best followed by gesture, atmosphere, and the slow accumulation of small rules that begin to shape a life. We will move from chairs to gloves, from fans to calling cards, and let the details settle one by one. What follows is less a catalog of rules than a quiet walk through a society where manners became. So there is no need to remember every prohibition at once. The important patterns will return on their own. For now, we need only one guiding thought. Etiquette here was not just politeness. It was a way of making the body legible. That is the first important thing to understand. In this world, etiquette was not simply a matter of being nice, polished, or well brought up. It was a way of making women readable. The body had to be interpreted quickly, almost at a glance. Was she modest, disciplined, calm, marriageable, properly raised? The answer was expected to appear before she said very much at all. So the rules spread everywhere, into posture, into clothing, into the way a chair was used, into where the hands rested, how the eyes were lowered, how the voice entered a room, how laughter was softened, how silence was kept from becoming awkward. Even small objects joined the system. Gloves, fans, hats, handkerchiefs, calling cards. None of them were only useful things. They became part of a social language, carrying signals about class, restraint, and self-command. That is why the world can feel so exhausting from the inside. Nothing is ever just itself. A back is never only a back. A glance is never only a glance. A seat, a letter, a tone of voice, a folded corner of paper. All of it can be read for meaning. Etiquette does not merely decorate life. It turns ordinary behavior into evidence. Victorian etiquette did not merely teach women how to behave. It taught them how to be watched. Once that pattern becomes clear, the strange details begin to settle into place. They are no longer a pile of isolated absurdities. They belong to one larger system, one that trained women to perform virtue through posture, timing, stillness, and the most immediate place that system touched the body was also the simplest to notice. The spine, the shoulders, the way a proper woman was expected to sit before she was ever allowed to speak. In the Victorian world, posture was not treated as a detail. It was treated as proof. Before a young woman had crossed a room or answered a polite question, her back had already begun speaking for her. The ideal was clear. Spine straight, shoulders composed, chin modestly lowered, hands folded, no leaning, no lounging, no visible surrender to comfort. To sit too easily was to suggest ease of character, and ease of character was not always trusted. So the body was trained early. Girls learned to sit without sinking, stand without slouching, and move without letting the upper body loosen into itself. Books were balanced on the head. Sewing lessons became lessons in stillness. Visits and meals became quiet rehearsals in how to be seen. The message was simple, if exhausting. Hold yourself well, or risk being read badly. There is something dryly absurd in it now, a whole moral world compressed into the angle of the shoulders. The neck must be long, but not proud. The chin lowered, but not timid. The hands calm, but not limp. Even stillness had to be managed. One can almost feel the muscles learning the lesson long before the mind agrees to it. And sometimes the lesson was enforced quite literally. Certain chairs were built to discourage comfort rather than provide it, narrow and corrective rather than restful. Some girls were made to practice upright, sitting for long stretches while stitching or reading. Others were fitted with supports or backboards meant to keep the torso in an approved line. It was not enough to advise the body. The body had to be shaped. What made all this harsher was the meaning attached to it. A straight spine suggested discipline, breeding, self-command. A curved one could be read as laziness, weakness, even moral looseness. Posture was rarely allowed to remain posture. It became character in visible form. A straight spine was treated less like anatomy and more like evidence. Class moved through it too. Good posture was expected to look natural in the well-born and faintly suspicious in those who had clearly worked to acquire it. Even success had to appear effortless. That, perhaps, was part of the cruelty. Then came the medical warnings, or something pretending to be medical. Poor posture was blamed for weak nerves, compressed organs, damaged femininity, future suffering, even difficulty in childbirth. And all of this existed alongside the corset, which tightened the torso, altered breath, and made the very ease society demanded much harder to perform. Women were expected to look naturally poised while being physically arranged into the shape of poise. And yet, the body learns rhythms, even under strain. Sit, hold, breathe quietly, endure, repeat. Day after day, the gestures settled into muscle until respectability seemed to live between the shoulder blades. But the scrutiny did not stop there. Once the spine had been disciplined, attention moved lower, to the stairs, the knees, the ankles, and the dangerous lower half of the body, where even one small shift could become social meaning. Once the spine had been disciplined, attention moved lower, and the rules became no less anxious. Ankles, knees, steps, and the angle of the feet all entered the same strange moral spotlight. A woman was not only expected to sit well, she was expected to walk, climb, turn, and lower herself into a chair as though the lower half of her body had never once entertained rebellion. She must glide, not stride. Her steps should seem measured, her skirts quiet, her movements smooth enough to suggest that effort had been removed before the body entered the room. Nothing too quick, nothing too forceful. Even haste could look improper if it disturbed the illusion of calm. And then there were the ankles, carrying far more social danger than any honest body part deserved. A brief glimpse while stepping into a carriage, climbing a stair, or lifting a hem from the mud could be treated as though something intimate had escaped into public view. The ankle was ordinary in reality, but in etiquette, it was charged with absurd significance, and absurd significance still has real consequences when enough people agree to believe it. This gave staircases their own elaborate tension. A woman going up the stairs with a man too near behind her could feel exposed. A woman descending toward a man waiting below was no less awkward. So people paused, gestured, insisted the other go first, and turned a simple flight of steps into a moral negotiation. Architecture itself became part of the code. Sitting was no safer. Feet were to remain quiet, ankles together, or arranged with exact modesty. Crossing the legs at the knee was out of the question. Even crossing the ankles too freely could suggest too much ease, too much self-possession, too little training. The lower body was expected to disappear into discipline while somehow continuing to move. That is the strange logic underneath it all in Victorian etiquette. Even the hidden parts of the body were expected to behave visibly, and so movement became a kind of embroidery, one foot placed carefully, then the other. No swinging, no careless tapping, no impatient shifting under the skirts. The body was not supposed to reveal fatigue or boredom or the simple wish to be comfortable. It was supposed to translate itself into grace. Seen together, the rules become almost dreamlike in their precision. But once we feel the precision, the next layer comes naturally into view. The surfaces that completed the performance, the gloves, the hair, the laughter, and the gaze. Once the lower body had been disciplined, society turned to the surfaces that finished the woman. Gloves, hair, laughter, the gaze, each of them ordinary enough on their own, and each of them made to carry far more meaning than they ever should have had to bear. Gloves were a good example of the whole system in miniature. To go out barehanded was not a small oversight. It could make a woman seem unfinished, careless, too exposed to the world. Her glove suggested polish, modesty, and distance all at once. It covered the hand, but it also softened contact itself. Even touch was expected to arrive through a layer of fabric first. In that sense, the glove was not only clothing, it was social insulation. It let a woman appear present without seeming too available, visible without seeming too near. Hair carried another kind of pressure. It was never just style. It signaled age, virtue, self-command, even marital condition. Softer arrangements could belong to youth. More controlled and gathered hair belonged to adulthood, especially marriage. Loose hair on a grown woman risked looking too emotional, too theatrical, too close to disorder. So pins, combs, oils, hidden padding, and careful arranging all work toward the same quiet effect. Not beauty alone, but disciplined beauty. A woman was expected to look composed long before anyone asked what she actually felt. Then there was laughter, which brings us closer to feeling itself. A woman could be amused, but not too freely. She might smile, let out a softened little sound, cover the mouth just enough, and keep the whole thing light. But anything louder, sharper, or more bodily could be read as boldness. And boldness, in the wrong woman, was always close to social danger. Joy was allowed only after it had been reduced to a manageable size. Even delight had to pass through etiquette before it could enter the room. The eyes followed the same logic. Looking too directly could suggest interest, Looking too long could suggest desire. Looking away too quickly could suggest nerves. So even attention had to be trained into something measured. A woman was expected to see, but not too openly, to notice, but not appear to reach. The gaze itself became a small act of discipline, as rehearsed as posture, and nearly as exhausting. The goal was not simply to dress a woman well, but to make even her joy and attention appear disciplined. And by now the pattern feels almost complete. The body must behave. The surface must behave. Feeling itself must behave. Once that is understood, the rules become less random and more severe in their coherence. Everything was meant to agree. Spine, ankles, hands, hair, laughter, glance. The whole visible self had to speak in one careful voice. And once direct speech and direct feeling had been pressed into such narrow shapes, other things had to begin speaking in their place. Once speech had been narrowed and feeling trained into smaller shapes, other things began to speak in its place. A fan, a handkerchief, two delicate objects, light enough to be dismissed as ornament, and yet capable of carrying more meaning than a bold sentence ever could in the wrong room. The fan came first, or at least seemed to. It was visible, theatrical, and perfectly suited to a world that preferred suggestion over declaration. Open it, close it, pause behind it. Let it hover near the cheek, lower it just enough to reveal the eyes. And suddenly, a woman might say far more than etiquette had meant to allow. Whether every gesture was truly part of a universal code matters a little less than the atmosphere such a code reveals. People believed or half believed that a fan could speak. And once that possibility entered the room, every movement acquired risk. A quick motion might dismiss. A slower one might invite. A glance over the lace edge might mean interest, or only boredom artfully disguised. That uncertainty was part of the charm. It gave women something rare, plausible deniability. If a message was understood, it had power. If it was challenged, it could become nothing at all. Only a lady adjusting her fan, only a hand cooling itself, only silk and feathers moving in warm air. The handkerchief worked more quietly, but no less intimately. It belonged to the hand, the sleeve, the pocketless improvisations of the day. Adopt handkerchief could be accident, of course. Yet once such gestures became socially legible, accident itself turned suspicious. To let a handkerchief fall before a gentleman was not always to speak plainly, but it could create an opening. He might return it, he might bow. A tiny moment of contact had been made, all while the larger room remained undisturbed. That is what makes these objects so interesting. They are never fully one thing. Part theater, part strategy, part wishful fiction, and perhaps part genuine invention by women who needed some means of saying more than the culture allowed them to say aloud. One can imagine manuals exaggerating the system, publishers delighting in the romance of it, and yet also imagine women quietly borrowing the idea and making use of it because it served them. A society that limited direct speech was always going to produce indirect speech somewhere, and indirect speech can become exquisitely skilled. A fan raised at the right instant, a handkerchief folded and refolded, a glance timed with the motion of fabric, a signal sent beneath the cover of refinement. These were not revolutions, certainly, but neither were they nothing. They were small acts of negotiation inside a world built to supervise female expression. And because they were small, they could survive when direct speech was limited. Even silk and linen had to learn how to talk. There is something almost tender in that, not because the rules were kind, but because human beings are inventive under pressure. If women were not permitted to speak openly, then feeling would find narrower channels. Through a flutter, through a dropped square of linen, through a motion so slight that only the intended pair of eyes would understand it. or think they did. And perhaps that uncertainty is the loveliest part. These systems may have been real, half-real, or romanticized beyond their actual use. But even as possibility, they tell us something true. They reveal a culture in which women needed room to imply, to invite, to refuse, to protect themselves, and to do all of it without appearing to have spoken at all. Restraint, in other words, produced its own secret poetry. But not every object in Victorian womanhood was allowed to become so expressive. Some were decorative, some symbolic, some subtly liberating, and some, increasingly, were denied altogether. So from these objects that learned to carry feeling, we can turn now to one that women were steadily being refused: the practical pocket. Not every Victorian object was allowed to become a secret language. Some were denied more bluntly than that. The pocket is a good example. It seems such a small thing now, almost too ordinary to matter. A place for a key, a coin, a folded note, a handkerchief. Some private little necessity. But by the 19th century, women were steadily being moved away from real functional storage and towards something smaller, prettier, and far less useful. The reticule, a delicate bag, decorative and portable, but rarely large enough to hold more than the barest handful of approved possessions. That shift matters more than it first appears to. A pocket hidden in the dress, or tied beneath the skirts, allowed a woman to carry things close to the body without display. Money, keys, small tools of daily life, all of it could travel with her quietly. A reticule changed that. It made carrying visible, limited, and fragile. It turned private usefulness into a public accessory. And because it was small, it forced choices. A coin, perhaps, a card, a handkerchief, but not much else. Practical life had to shrink to fit the decorative ideal. The result was not only inconvenience, it was dependence. A woman who could not easily carry her own things had to plan more carefully, rely more often on others, and move through the world with less spontaneity. If she needed money, she must have thought of it beforehand. If she needed a key, she must have arranged it. If she needed room for anything awkward, weighty, or useful, she was already out of luck. The rule seems almost small at first, but its meaning rests heavily once we notice it. When a woman cannot carry her own things, she cannot move through the world in the same way. That is the quiet politics hidden inside the fabric. A pocket is never only a pocket. It is access. It is readiness. It is the ability to go somewhere, buy something, keep something, or leave quickly if needed. To lose it is to lose a little ease of movement, a little independence of action, a little private control over the day. And so, as always, women adapted. Hidden pockets were stitched where they could be. Small things were tucked into petticoats, sleeves, gloves, and even the deeper architecture of dress itself. Keys might hang on a ribbon beneath the skirts. Coins might disappear into a seam. These were not grand rebellions. They were material workarounds, quiet acts of refusal against a system that preferred women decorative and lightly burdened, rather than equipped. There is something moving in that practicality. No manifesto, no spectacle. Only a woman finding some corner of fabric where life might still fit. A hidden pocket, a tucked key, a secret coin, a private answer to a public inconvenience. And once we begin to see that, the logic of appearance broadens again. It was not only what a woman carried, but how she presented herself in public at all that had to be carefully managed. The next layer sat higher, on the head and in full view, where status, modesty, mourning, and visibility came together beneath ribbon, feather, and brim. And by now, the Victorian woman has learned that identity must travel ahead of her in more than one form. It goes out into the world worn on the body, and it goes out into the world on paper. The hat is the first of these, because a woman did not step outdoors bareheaded unless she wished to look unfinished, impulsive, or improperly free of supervision. A bonnet, a walking hat, a mourning veil, a carefully chosen ribbon, each one announced something before the woman herself had spoken. Age, status, season, mood, modesty, money, even grief could be arranged there above the face in straw, velvet, crepe, lace, and feather. A widow's hat darkened the whole figure. A younger woman's bonnet might soften her into innocence. A fashionable brim could suggest taste, but too much taste might become ambition. And ambition on a woman was always a little risky. Even the hatpin carried its own small drama. It held the whole construction in place, but it also hinted at defense, a long, thin instrument hidden in plain sight. The hat, like so much else in this world, was both ornament and structure. It made a woman visible, but only in an approved way. It completed the public version of her. Then came the other self she had to send into the world. The visiting card. If the hat announced her at a glance, the card announced her by procedure. Thick enough, but not too thick. Elegant, but not showy. Properly engraved, properly folded, properly delivered. A card could say you had called in person, that you offered condolences, that you brought congratulations, that you remained within the circle of acceptable attention. It was a tiny rectangle, asked to carry an astonishing amount of social meaning. And like all good Victorian systems, it made ordinary interaction feel faintly bureaucratic. One did not simply visit. One left a card. One returned a call within the proper interval. One folded the corner correctly. One did not arrive too early, too late, too eagerly, or too neglectfully. The social world ran not only on charm, but on paper logistics. Victorian identity was often carried into the world twice, once on the body and once on paper. That is what makes hats and cards belong together so neatly. One was worn, one was delivered, but both translated the self into portable signs, a brim shape, a ribbon, a veil, a pin, then cardstock, engraving, folded corners, and calling hours. Personality itself begins to feel sorted, labeled, and filed into visible forms. And there is something almost soothing in that orderliness, however severe it may be. The whole system acquires a quiet texture of repetition, as though social life had been arranged into ribbons, card cases, and polished entry trays. But of course, these signals were not made merely to exist. They were made to be tested. A hat had to enter a room. A card had to open a door. And so from these portable signs, we can move now into the places where they were judged most carefully. The visit, the parlor, and the long performance of being received. And now we enter the room where all the earlier rules seem to gather and become visible at once. The parlor was supposed to look gentle. Soft chairs, patterned wallpaper, a tea tray glinting in low light, a piano closed for the moment, or waiting with quiet menace in the corner. Curtains drawn just enough to soften the afternoon. The air touched with perfume, starch, lamp oil, and the faint dryness of polished wood. It looked like comfort. It looked like civility, but for a Victorian woman. The parlor was rarely a place of rest. It was the room where she was most, carefully arranged. Even choosing where to sit required judgment, not too close to the center, unless invited, not too far away, unless invisibility was safer. A chair near the hostess carried one kind of meaning, a place by the window another. The sofa was its own small danger, because sofa suggested conversation, and conversation suggested proximity. To sit too near the wrong person, or too easily, or too much at leisure, was to risk saying something before speaking at all. And then there was the piano, which waited like a polite trap. A woman might be asked to play, but she could not seem eager. She must hesitate once, perhaps twice, and then accept with just enough reluctance to prove modesty, but not so much that she appeared sulky. Once seated, she must perform with grace, but never with hunger for applause. Talent was attractive only if softened by restraint. Even music had to wear gloves. Tea offered no true relief. A cup had to be lifted correctly, held correctly, sipped without haste and without noise. Biscuits were accepted lightly or declined lightly, but never with appetite. Appetite of any kind was troublesome in rooms like this. Everything had to look measured. Even enjoyment must leave only a delicate trace. Conversation was perhaps the strangest labor of all. One was expected to speak, yet not say too much to sound thoughtful, but never forceful, pleasant, but never candid. Safe topics gathered like furniture around the room. Weather, flowers, charitable events, books of an acceptable kind, perhaps a sermon if kept sufficiently mild. Nothing too political, nothing too bodily, nothing too emotional, nothing that might reveal an unregulated mind moving beneath the ribbons and lace. So the real art was not saying nothing, but saying almost nothing beautifully. A woman learned how to nod at the proper interval, how to place a sentence where it would do the least harm, how to ask a question that sounded interested without sounding hungry for information. She learned how to laugh softly, how to let silence pass without becoming awkward, how to rescue a conversation that had wandered too near reality. There was skill in it, certainly, but it was the skill of containment. The Victorian parlor was not a room for rest. It was a stage for controlled personality, and yet, like so much in this world, its severity was wrapped in softness. Tea steam lifting into lamplight, silk moving quietly against upholstery, a cuff brushing porcelain, the low murmur of voices taking care not to become too alive. One can see why the room felt so persuasive. It did not command in the language of punishment. It commanded in the language of gentleness, and for that reason it may have been harder to resist. A woman could become tired there without appearing tired. She could become bored without admitting boredom. She could sit through an entire hour of polished emptiness and leave behind nothing more scandalous than the memory that she had been agreeable. That, too, was a kind of performance, decorative exhaustion, beautifully managed, and from there the system only grew sharper, because outside the parlor's soft surveillance waited a stricter order still, one made of rank, placement, and visible hierarchy. The tea table would give way to the dinner table, and the quiet testing of personality would become the harder geometry of seating charts, ritual courses, and the careful display of who mattered and where. And then there was dinner, where hospitality dressed itself as ritual and rank arranged itself in candlelight. The Victorian dining table was never only a place to eat. It was a place to be placed before the first course appeared. The room had already begun its quiet work of sorting people into importance. The hostess ruled this arrangement with a seriousness that could make a military officer seem casual. She decided who sat near her, who sat near the host, who was rewarded with proximity, and who was sent gently but unmistakably down the line. A place card could flatter, it could punish, it could restore favor, or withdraw it without a word being spoken. For a woman, this meant that dinner began before she touched the chair. She must wait for the right moment to sit, lower herself without a sound, arrange skirts and posture in one controlled motion, and appear immediately composed, as though the whole business of taking a seat required no body at all. Even then, the body had to remain discreet. The back was not to surrender too fully. The hands must rest properly. The napkin must be unfolded without fuss and placed across the lap as though it had simply drifted there. And all the while, the table itself kept announcing its hierarchy. The most favored guests sat nearest the centers of power. The less significant drifted outward. One could read a whole social atmosphere in the distance between a chair and the hostess's elbow. To be placed beside a dull cousin was one message, beside an eligible gentleman, another, beside someone impossible to converse with. Perhaps a punishment, or perhaps a test. No arrangement was innocent. The table looked elegant, but it behaved like a map. Conversation, too, was choreographed. A woman did not simply speak across the table to whoever interested her. She was expected to direct herself in the proper rhythm, to one side, then the other, keeping the whole exchange in motion without ever seeming animated by genuine appetite for connection. This was not the intimacy of a shared meal. It was the management of impression through courses. Then came the practical trial of eating while pretending the body had no practical needs. The cutlery multiplied. Forks and knives and spoons waited in polished ranks, each one with its own correct moment. The napkin must dab, never wipe. The mouth must close. The teeth must never announce themselves. The appetite must remain perfectly civilized, no matter what strange arrangement of sauce, fish, custard, or game arrived on the plate. Nothing was to be reached for too eagerly. Nothing was to be seasoned too soon. One did not reveal hunger. One revealed breeding. This may be the oddest part of the whole performance. Dinner was full of food, and yet one was not supposed to appear governed by eating. A woman must consume without seeming physical, choose without seeming desirous, and finish without suggesting either greed or dislike. If something tasted dreadful, that fact must disappear into poise. If something delighted her, that too must be softened into moderation. The man could fill the table, but need itself was unwelcome there. At dinner, status could be measured in inches from the hostess and in the angle of a woman's fork. That is what gives the Victorian table its peculiar tension. It was a social audit disguised as comfort, a moral performance disguised as hospitality. The candles glowed, the silver shone, the servants moved soundlessly in and out, yet beneath all that polish was a constant pressure to prove that one deserved to be seated exactly where one had been placed. And by now the rules fall into a pattern clear enough to rest in, even if no one living under them could have rested easily. Rank above appetite, composure above comfort, surface above need. Again and again the body is asked to disappear into form, and again the room rewards the woman who can make that disappearance look effortless. So dinner ends as it began, with arrangement. The ladies rise at the proper cue. Chairs slide back. Napkins are left behind. The men remain. The room loosens, but only a little, and as one ritual gives way to another, the larger lesson sharpens. Once even eating required this much choreography. Intimacy itself could not possibly be left unsupervised. And once the table had done its work, once rank had been displayed in candles and silver and controlled appetite, the next problem waited just beyond the dining room. Desire itself. Not desire in any open modern sense. Nothing so simple as two people left alone to discover whether they liked one another. Victorian courtship did not trust that kind of freedom. It placed something, or someone, in between. A mother, an aunt, an older sister, a governess, a married family friend with excellent posture and a talent for hearing everything while pretending to hear nothing. The chaperone entered the scene as witness, guardian, interpreter, and barrier all at once. This meant that even the smallest exchange had to pass through supervision. A visit from a gentleman was not really a private visit. It was a conversation conducted in the presence of furniture, relatives, and carefully arranged silence. He might call in the afternoon, bow properly, comment on the weather, inquire after health, and sit at the approved distance while a third person remained in the room, like a moral landmark. Every sentence had an audience. Every pause had a witness. A walk was no better. A young woman did not simply stroll beside a man she liked. She moved through air already thick with observation. The chaperone remained nearby, close enough to hear, close enough to interrupt, close enough to convert a private hope into a supervised outing. A garden path, a church step, a carriage stop, none of them were neutral ground. They were all stages upon which feeling had to disguise itself as correctness. That is what makes the eye so important here. Eye contact became one of the few remaining places where feeling might still flicker with some directness, and so it too had to be managed. A glance too long could suggest interest. A glance too warm could suggest intention. A glance returned too boldly could seem almost like a confession. So women learned to soften the gaze, lower it, redirect it, let it rest on gloves, on flowers, on a cup, on anything that might keep the heart from becoming too visible through the eyes. Attention itself had to be chaperoned, and yet the chaperone was not only an obstacle. That is the strange part. She could restrict desire, certainly, but she also made desire legible. A supervised visit was still a visit. A permitted walk was still a kind of nearness. The very rules that prevented privacy also created the narrow channels through which courtship could safely move. Without the witness, there could be scandal. With the witness, there could at least be an acknowledged possibility. Desire was not abolished. It was routed. That makes the whole system feel both cruel and oddly tender. Cruel, because almost nothing could belong entirely to the pair themselves. The conversation was overheard. The timing was managed. The setting was approved in advance. Even a letter might pass through family hands before it reached its destination. But tender, too, because within those narrow restrictions, people still found ways to feel, to signal, to hope. A pause held a little too long, a question that sounded ordinary, but was not. A glance permitted just long enough to matter, then withdrawn before it became dangerous. Victorian courtship did not remove desire. It surrounded desire with furniture, family, and witnesses. There is a strange quiet sadness in that arrangement. Not melodrama, not tragedy in its loudest form, but a softer kind of frustration. The sense that every feeling had to pass through another person first, before it could safely reach the one for whom it was meant. Nothing traveled directly. Everything was filtered, softened, watched over, and in that watching, altered. One can imagine the exhaustion of it, to want to ask a question and know that someone else is listening. To want to linger and know that time itself is being measured. To want to laugh freely, or speak honestly, or simply sit in silence beside the person who interests you, and find that each of those things has already been trimmed into a socially acceptable version before you can even attempt it. And yet this is exactly why the next ritual mattered so much. Because in a world so determined to supervise closeness, the dance offered something nearly miraculous for a few measured minutes. Public, yes. Controlled, certainly. Still watched from every edge of the room, but closer, near enough for music, breath, movement, and the careful shock of proximity to do what conversation alone could not. So from the chaperone's watchful shadow, we can move now toward the ballroom, where etiquette briefly allowed desire to step into motion. And so, at last, the room changes. The parlor, the dinner table, the supervised walk, all of them have trained desire into silence. But the ballroom offers another arrangement. Not freedom exactly, nothing so generous as that. Still, for a few measured minutes, the rules allow movement where stillness once ruled, and proximity where distance had been carefully maintained. It begins, as so many Victorian things do, with paper. The dance card is small, delicate, almost pretty enough to seem harmless. But it is not harmless. It is a map of attention, obligation, and risk. Each blank line waits to be filled with a name, and every name placed there alters the shape of the evening. A slot given too quickly may suggest eagerness. Too many empty spaces may suggest neglect. Too many dances with the same man may suggest something more dangerous still. That feeling has begun to slip beyond supervision and into preference. So the card must be managed carefully. A gentleman approaches, bows, and asks for a dance. A woman cannot accept too warmly, nor refuse too plainly. She must glance down, judge the card, consider the hour, remember which refusals are allowed, and answer in a tone that sounds effortless, though nothing about it is. Even the smallest choice has an afterlife. Who was granted the third dance, who was denied the sixth, who received a polite excuse, and who was written down in careful pencil, to be met later under the light. The room notices all of it. That is part of the thrill. Courtship in this world is never fully private. It exists as pattern, sequence, repetition. If one man appears on the card too often, people begin to count. If he returns again and again, they begin to wonder. Interest has to pass through arithmetic before it can become romance. A woman might dance once with courtesy, twice with intention, a third time, and the whole room is already writing a future around her. Then comes the waltz. It is difficult now to recover how startling it once seemed, but startling it was. Older dances had kept the body at safer distances, arranging courtship through lines, glances, and brief hand contact. The waltz did something else. It closed the space. It turned the couple inward. It let one gloved hand settle into another, let a man's arm circle the approved boundary of a woman's waist, and let the two of them move through the room as though they belonged, however briefly, to the same current. That was enough to alarm an age built on separation. And yet, the dance survived, because it could be supervised. Chaperones remained. Mothers watched, unsubserved from upholstered edges of the room. Every turn took place beneath chandeliers, candlelight, and the collective gaze of society. Desire was not set free. It was translated into acceptable motion. A Victorian dance was never just a dance. It was flirtation translated into acceptable geometry. That is why the ballroom feels so bright and so tense at once. Music gives the illusion of release, but the release is measured down to the step. A woman may move, but only correctly. She may be held, but only within the formal frame. She may feel the strange electricity of nearness, but even that feeling must travel through gloves, posture, count, and public decorum before it can settle into anything real. And still, for a few turns beneath the chandeliers, the rules loosen just enough to feel almost like freedom. That may be the most touching part of it. Not that the dance erased supervision, but that it made room inside supervision for something living to pass through. A glance could last a second longer in motion than it ever could in a parlor chair. A sentence murmured between turns might carry more warmth than an entire afternoon visit. A woman might feel, for one measured circuit of the room, that she was not merely being watched, but also being met. Then the music ends, hands part, a bow, a curtsy. The card closes. The couple returns to separate places in the room, and the old distance settles back over everything like lace, lowered over furniture. But the brightness of the dance does not disappear entirely. It lingers, faintly, as the evening turns inward again, back toward the quieter worlds where hospitality, letters, and emotional management continue the performance in softer forms. After the brightness of the ballroom, the world closes in again. A house visit seems quieter on the surface, almost restful. A guest room, a washstand, a folded blanket, a bell pull hanging by the bed, like a question you are slightly afraid to ask. But the visit is not freedom from performance. It is only a slower form of it. A woman staying in another family's house is expected to become agreeable in extended form, grateful without excess, tidy without being invisible, present without ever seeming to impose. Even arrival has its own softness of pressure. Your bags are taken. Your room is shown. You are expected to admire the arrangement, but not too warmly, as though comfort were a gift you receive gracefully rather than a condition you might actually need. Then the household rhythm begins to close around you. Breakfast at the proper hour, morning conversation at the proper temperature, gratitude offered in just the right amount, never gushing, never thin. Too much thanks becomes theatrical, too little becomes cold. Privacy, too, is only partial. A Victorian guest room may have a door, but it rarely feels private in the modern sense. Servants enter and leave, floors creak, water arrives by hand, the bell pull waits in the corner, useful and faintly alarming, because to use it is to ask openly for service, and to ask too openly was always dangerous in a culture that prized graceful dependence over visible need. So the guest learns to leave no trace, gloves folded, brushes aligned, garments kept discreetly out of view, the bed left respectable, the room passed through without ever seeming fully inhabited. Even departure becomes ritual, a thank you properly spoken, a note perhaps left behind, a final impression arranged with care, so that one's presence lingers as sweetness rather than burden. Then, once the visit is over, there is still the letter, and the letter is its own chamber of discipline, quieter than the parlor, but no less exacting. The paper must be right, the ink must be right, the fold, the seal, the tone. All of it must be chosen with care. A woman may appear more alone at a writing desk than in any drawing room, but even here she is not entirely free. The written self must also be composed, softened, and made legible. Too warm, and she risks impropriety. Too cool, and she risks seeming unfeeling. A single phrase can lean too far in either direction. So letters become a private labor of elegance. Gratitude must sound sincere without sounding overdone. Affection must be hinted rather than declared. Regret must be softened. Longing must pass through metaphor, through weather, through flowers, through the memory of an afternoon, not directly named. Even scent may join the performance, a trace of lavender, violet, or rose water carrying what the sentences themselves cannot safely say. Even privacy in the Victorian world often arrived already formatted for display, and yet the letter still holds something the room could not. For all its rules, it offers a woman one of the few places where her voice may be arranged by her own hand. Not fully free, perhaps, but more her own than speech under supervision. She chooses the paper. She chooses the wording. She chooses how much to conceal, and how much to let breathe between the lines. Through scent, paper, pressure, and pause, she leaves a self behind that is curated, yes, but still unmistakably hers. There is a quiet tenderness in that. A world so determined to shape a woman's outward life still cannot entirely prevent her from making a tone, a rhythm, a hidden warmth that belongs to her alone. And once we see that, the final shape of the whole system begins to darken a little. Because if even visits and letters had to be managed so carefully, then grief itself, when it came, could never be left untouched by etiquette either. There was one final etiquette system that revealed the whole world more clearly than any parlor glove or dance card ever could. Mourning, because mourning was not simply sorrow in the Victorian world. It was sorrow arranged, timed, worn, displayed, and measured. It was grief translated into fabric, stationery, visits refused, colors withdrawn, music silenced, and whole stretches of life turned dim on purpose. But a woman was not only expected to suffer a loss, she was expected to suffer it correctly. The first sign was the dress, not merely black, but the right black, matte, heavy, lightless black, the kind that absorbed brightness instead of reflecting it. Veils drawn low, crepe that seemed to drink the room around it, jewelry stripped back to the acceptable few pieces, jet if one could afford it, or something made from the hair of the dead, which sounds to us almost unbearably intimate, and yet belonged naturally to a world where sentiment and display were forever entwined. Mourning did not hide grief, it formalized it, and once the clothes were in place, the rest of life narrowed around them. Visits became fewer, invitations were refused, music softened or disappeared. Social brightness had to be dimmed so that the body itself might remain legible as grieving. A widow, especially, entered a long season in which the world expected stillness from her and called that expectation respect. Months passed under veil and black fabric, then more months, then sometimes years. The ritual did not ask merely whether she was sad. It asked whether she could keep sadness visible for as long as the culture required. That is what makes mourning so revealing. Earlier rules taught women how to sit, smile, glide, and conceal appetite. Mourning taught them how to withdraw without vanishing, how to remain socially readable even in pain. Grief itself had to become orderly. The right stationery with dark borders, the right degree of absence from public life, the right gradual return of muted color when the appointed stage had passed. Not too soon, or she seemed cold, not too late, or she seemed excessive. Even sorrow had a timetable. Victorian society did not merely tell women how to live in public. It told them how to grieve in public too. And the burden was not shared equally. Men mourned, certainly, but their mourning was shorter, simpler, and more forgiving. A dark suit, a black band, a temporary dimming of ordinary pleasure. For women, the expectation was fuller, heavier, and far more visible. The body carried grief outward for everyone else to read. A man might suffer and resume. A woman was expected to wear suffering like a season of her life. There is something deeply unfair in that, and yet also something more complicated, because within mourning, some women seem to have found a strange and limited power. The veil could hide as much as it declared. The black dress could remove a woman, at least briefly, from some of the ordinary demands of prettiness, cheerfulness, and social availability. The world that had once insisted she smiled gently, dress attractively, and glide through every room with agreeable self-command now permitted silence. It permitted retreat. It permitted a kind of stillness that ordinary femininity often did not. The ritual was a prison, yes, but for some it may also have become a shelter. That is why mourning feels so different from the earlier rules, even while belonging to the same system. It is gentler in tone, darker in fabric, quieter in movement. The same world that regulated pleasure now regulates pain. The same culture that read posture and laughter now reads the depth and duration of grief. Only the lighting has changed. The logic remains. A veil lowered across the face, a room gone dim, a black-edged letter placed quietly on a tray. A woman returning to society by stages, not because sorrow has ended, but because etiquette has decided how long sorrow may remain visible. There is a hush in this final discipline, a shadowed gentleness, because at last the world permits stillness, even if it still refuses freedom. And perhaps that is why mourning lingers so strongly in the mind. It is the last and clearest proof that etiquette was never only about charm. It was about legibility, about turning the whole of a woman's visible life into something others could read, approve, question, or rank. Even grief could not remain wholly private. It had to pass through clothing, timing, ritual, and shared interpretation before it was allowed to exist in public. So now the heavy fabrics can begin to soften, the veil may lower, and then, at last, begin to lift. The dark stationery can return to drawers, the room can slowly regain its light, and with that slow easing, we can move toward the final quiet thought beneath all of this. The one that has been waiting under posture and gloves and cards and dances and all the rest. What kind of life does it make, when almost everything must be performed before it can be believed? And so, gently, we leave the room behind. The parlor chair, the folded gloves, the fan lifted just enough to hide and reveal at once, the visiting card left on a silver tray, the careful dinner seat, the supervised walk, the dance card filling line by line beneath chandelier light, the dark veil lowered over mourning black, one by one. The objects and rules that built this world begin to recede. Taken together, they leave us with a truth stranger than any single rule. Victorian etiquette was never only a collection of manners. It was a long and intricate system for making women publicly readable. The spine had to mean something. The hand had to mean something. The laugh, the glance, the hem, the letter, the hat, the silence, all of it had to carry a message that others could interpret. Respectability depended on that constant translation. The strangest truth of Victorian etiquette is that beneath all its polish, it was a system for turning a woman's whole life into a performance others could read. And yet, that is not the only truth. Women lived inside that system, but they were never only passive inside it. They learned it, bent it, survived it, and sometimes hid themselves within it so skillfully that the rules meant to contain them became, in miniature, tools of expression. A fan became a whisper, a letter became a private stage, a hidden pocket became a small act of independence. A dance, though supervised, still made room for feeling. Even mourning, for all its weight, could offer a strange permission to step back from the bright obligations of being pleasing. That is worth remembering now, at the end. Not only the absurdity, though there was plenty of that, not only the pressure, though it was constant, but also the wit, the adaptation, the quiet ingenuity of women required to perform so much for so long. Under all the starch, ribbon, upholstery, and instruction, life still moved. Feelings still found channels. Personality still survived. And now, tonight, you do not have to do any of it. No one is grading the angle of your back. No one is listening to your laughter for signs of vulgarity. No one is counting your dances, checking your gloves, measuring your gratitude, or deciding what your silence must mean. You do not need to look modest in lamplight. You do not need to carry your feelings through silk and paper. You do not need to earn rest by appearing graceful first. You may simply rest, let the posture go, let the shoulders soften, Let the careful smile fade. Let the invisible audience leave the room. The tea has gone cool. The parlor is empty now. The piano is closed. The visiting cards lie still in their tray. The dance is over. The veil is folded away. The house has quieted. And what remains is something simpler than all those rules ever allowed. Breath, blanket, dimness, quiet. No choreography now. No performance, no polished answer required. Only the soft weight of the night. Only the bed beneath you. Only the slow unfastening of effort. Like loosening stays, like pins being lifted from hair. Like lamplight lowering at last, you have done enough, more than enough. So let the rooms grow distant. Let the silk, the cards, the whispers, the rules all fade into a gentler blur. And keep only this final feeling, that you are no longer being watched. Nothing needs to be signaled. That you do not have to mean anything to anyone for the next few hours. Only breathe, only soften, only rest. Slowly now, and more slowly still. The night is quiet. The house is still. The performance is over. Sleep.